Occasionally I do videos that are shot in response to some sort of question that a viewer or sometimes a student will ask me that I think are particularly interesting, that I can get a lot of mileage out of, so to speak, and which I think might be helpful for other people. And I've got a question that's being asked to me by one of my subscribers who often comments on my videos. And it has to do with anger, which is something that I've given a lot of thought to and have a lot of experience with. And he asks, I know that you've done some videos about Aristotle's views on anger, but I realize that it's an area you've done a lot of study in. Recently I've been having some of my own troubles with anger, so I was wondering if it would be possible at some time you could do a more personal video about your experiences with anger and what you have learned in your studies. And there's more to it than that, but I think actually that in order to adequately respond to this, it's probably going to take more than one video, even as long as my videos tend to be. So I think what I want to talk about in this one, I'll mention a few of my own personal experiences with anger and why I'm so particularly interested in it as a philosophical topic, but then I'll also talk about much more about the resources that I've found in philosophy and also to a certain extent in theology and in psychotherapeutic theory about how to make sense of it and thereby adding to it some work on my part, what for me allowed me to become a less angry person and to have better understanding and control over my own anger, which might be useful for other people. I'm not saying that there's a one-size-fits-all solution to this. So I have been a very angry person throughout my life. If there is anything like a genuine and true theory of temperaments, I am definitely a choleric, meaning somebody who tends to take offense rather easily, to get angry, and really in large respect, I'm not one of the good cholerics. I've had for a long time a tendency to hold on to anger, to develop grudges, to act on them, and it's only, I would say, in the last 10 years of my life, out of, and I'm in my 40s, that I've been able to make much progress on that, and a large part of that consisted in seeing just how counterproductive and ultimately useless a lot of what I was engaged in was for me, and how hurtful it was to other people around me. So, I'll talk in another video, I think, about some of my own experiences with this. But I will say this, my anger led to me when I was a kid getting into a lot of fights and feeling bad a lot of the time. It went so far as to result in me, when I was 16 years old, becoming a ward of the court. Because my mother, by that time my dad had died, and there were all sorts of things surrounding that, filed an uncontrollability petition with the court because I was out of control, and I was getting in quite a bit of trouble, and a lot of that had to do with my own inability to understand and manage my own anger. I would say that I've managed, if not necessarily to ruin, at least to screw up and then have to do a lot of damage control afterwards, a lot of relationships because of my response of anger. And I think there's opportunities that I've passed up or which I threw away because of getting angry that would have placed me further along in my career, or even maybe resulted in doing a different kind of thing. I still struggle quite a bit with anger. Really, the closer that a person is to me, the more vulnerable I am to getting hurt and angry in response to things that they do, which is actually an improvement, because I used to get angry with students, and that doesn't happen too much anymore, unless they're really engaging in egregious behavior, like plagiarizing and then telling me that they didn't plagiarize and that it's okay and that sort of thing. But I still have a lot to do and a lot of ground to cover when it comes to my intimate personal relationships, and getting better and better control on my anger. And I'm a person who thinks that anger is not something that we want to eliminate altogether. I agree with the philosophers who, like Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, who think that anger has a legitimate function and scope, and that the real challenge is to figure out what that is, because we're usually wrong in the way that we see it, and then to realign the self and its responses and desires and thoughts and attitudes to be more in line with right anger. So, all that said, and again, I'll probably shoot another video some other time about anger in my life, all the different, not all the different, but representative occasions where getting angry just was the wrong idea, and perhaps where I got some of my wrong-headed ideas about anger from. Because we really do belong to a culture that is totally screwed up with respect to anger. And you get the wrong message as a kid and as a young adult and as a continuing adult over and over and over again through all sorts of means. So, it really, if you don't end up having anger problems, you're kind of lucky. Or you're fortunate enough to be in a household that or had a mentor who kind of trained you right, or maybe you had the kind of disposition that didn't get angry and kind of let things go, which would be kind of nice. Anyway, what I want to talk about are, I would say, somewhere from 5 to 7 or 8 thinkers who study of whom has really helped me to better understand the way anger works and why I get angry and what I get angry about and whether I'm getting angry for the right reason and how to get myself out of that, how to dig myself out of the pit that anger often becomes, and how to avoid letting it congeal into things that are much worse. Sort of collaborating with the worst parts of ourselves. So I'm not going to present these thinkers like in the order that I started, thinking through them. I'll just do it in kind of a sequential order as far as their time, where they fit into the philosophical timeline. I would say that one of the thinkers who I've learned quite a bit from, even though he doesn't have a systematic account of anger as such, is Plato. And Plato's discussions of anger are kind of scattered across his works. One of the early important things that I came into contact with was his discussion in the Republic about the parts of the soul, or if you don't like the word soul, say personality. And the way he's got it, the human being has this rational part that when it's functioning right, it contains wisdom as a virtue and reasons out the way one ought to live, what would be good for oneself and what would be right and just. And that part is the highest part of ourself, but it's also relatively vulnerable to being used by the lower parts. And the lowest part is the appetites, and these are multiple, and they're very strong in human beings, and they're for all sorts of things like sex or for food, for money, because money can buy us these sorts of things, for pleasures of all different sorts. And then there's this middle part that Plato calls thumos, and it's sometimes translated as spirit or passion, neither of which are very good translations. And the word thumos can actually mean anger. Plato defines it as the part with which we get angry. This middle part is also the locus for the virtue of courage or of cowardice. And there's a connection between anger and courage, because if you think about it, when you get angry, you are very often placed in a situation that you feel to be a conflict, and to be angry can provide you with the impetus that you need in order to be courageous. But it's kind of mercurial. To be angry is not quite the same thing, or to be under the control of anger is not quite the same thing as to actually have and exercise the virtue of courage. This middle part, thumos, is required in order for the rational part to rule over the appetites. In the city, it corresponds to the auxiliaries, the police force, the army, that are needed to get the unruly citizenry, who would be motivated just by their desires, to actually obey the dictates of the higher, the better part. And I think there's something to that view. This middle part is also the part of us that is particularly concerned with honor, with our view of ourselves and with how others view us. And if you think about it, when we get angry, very often it's because we feel there's some sort of violation of our dignity, our honor, what is expected by us of other people, or at least perceived to be so. And another thing that Plato says that's particularly important, I think, is he talks about, and he does this in several different dialogues, what are the things that we get angry at each other about, when we get into disagreements about? And it's not really so much, just factual matters like who did what, and or how much money is there in the till, or things like that. We can get mad at each other over those sorts of things, but if it's just a merely factual question, it's pretty easily addressed, and we can deal with it. And if somebody wants to be really stubborn, they can continue to be angry and fight about it. But usually, if they're at all reasonable, you can say, look, there's $5 left. Let's count it. What we get angry about are the realm of what we can call values, and disagreements with each other on values. And even though we can make cases to each other why something has the value it has, or why somebody else should see it this way, we often don't convince each other. And Plato goes so far as to say it's not just human beings that get angry with each other and fight with each other on account of these things. It's even the gods. The Greek gods don't see eye to eye on matters of goodness and badness in its various modalities, which include in particular the just and the unjust, the advantageous or beneficial and the harmful, and most importantly, the noble or honorable and the base or ugly or dishonorable, to kalon and to aischron. And we're liable to get angry over these things, in part because we feel them so deeply. And you might say, well, then we should get away from values. Values are purely subjective, and we don't want to get into that. That's not the route that Plato takes. And that's what I love about Plato. I'll say this. It makes me angry, and I actually don't like people who say, values are all subjective, and it's just in the eye of the beholder. For the ancient Greeks, at least, and the medievals, there is a subjectivity to it, but some people are wrong and some people are right. And that's not to say that we always know exactly what's right, but we sure as hell need to work towards it. And when we're actually right, one way in which we can tell is we're actually aligned with other people who've got it right. And it's easy to get angry in this process, Plato would point out. Plato also seems to think that we have some legitimate role for anger in our lives, and he doesn't quite spell this out. And I think if you had to push him when it comes to the legitimate scope and role for anger, he would say it's probably narrower than somebody like Aristotle would say. So another person that's really important in my thinking about anger is Aristotle. And Aristotle doesn't have a treatise on anger, but Aristotle has a very complex, systematically worked out, very sophisticated, but yet still skeletal theory of anger running through his works. And you can find it in the rhetoric and in the ethics, Nicomachean and Eudemian, in parts of the politics, in parts of on the soul, in the topics, in some of the physical treatises, in mentions in on memory and on dreams. It's brought up over and over and over again. He uses it as one of the most common examples for quite a few things, and he tells us a lot about anger in the process. And one of the things that I found very useful, Aristotle tells us that one of the main causes of anger for us is the perception on our part that we are being wronged by another person. That is, that they're doing some harm to us, and they're doing it wrongly. They're doing, he says that when we're punished and we actually think we deserve the punishment, we don't get angry. It's when we think that we don't deserve the way that we're being treated. And the way that he's being treated he calls olegoria, or slighting, literally a making little. And he calls this a sort of, what should we call it, activation or manifestation of holding another in low esteem, of thinking little of them. And the role that appearance plays for Aristotle is very important, not only in causing anger, but also in our desire. Our desire is to impose retribution, timoresis, on the other person. And he uses the same term, apparent, phainomene, for that as well. And that can mean public, or that could mean apparent, or that could mean even something like in our imagination. So, Aristotle's attuned to a lot of important aspects of anger, and he's got this whole discussion of how it comes about and the various, common modes in which it comes about, and who we tend to get more angry when we're, in the presence of, and who we tend to become more calm in relation to. So all these exacerbating factors, Aristotle was attentive to these. And his theory doesn't cover everything. There's some things where you read it and on its surface you're like, nah, I think you got that wrong. But most of the stuff, he seems to be pretty right. And Aristotle thinks that there are times when we should be angry. There are people who we should be angry with. There are matters about which we should be angry. We tend to go too far to the extreme, to the extreme of too much, getting too angry, getting angry at too many people rather than the person that we're actually angry at, holding on to our anger for too long and not being as forgiving as we ought to be. But Aristotle thinks there are some things that shouldn't be forgiven. And he thinks that there are some cases of our being belittled or pushed around that we ought to get angry at, and that it's good for us to do so. And it would be actually bad on the other side for us not to do so, to not stand up for ourselves, or not to stand up for those who are connected with us. In my case, like, for example, my children. I should get mad at a teacher who unjustly assigns bad grades to my kids and then won't listen to reason. That would be a case where Aristotle would think that would be quite legitimate. But Aristotle's one about measure and proportion, so that's something good. And he's very focused on how do we change our feelings and our attitudes and our behavior. It has to do with how we choose to use that little bit of freedom that we have in actual situations where we find ourselves. And he notes that anger is one of those emotions that tends to get away from us. We're subject to being what he calls acratic, that is, to lose our self-control and to be led around by the kind of reasoning that is endemic to anger, which is kind of a reason light or pseudo reasoning, not really rationality functioning at its highest. So I'll tell you, for me, thinking through these things really helped me out in real situations. Now, another thinker that has been really influential on my own attitudes towards these matters is Epictetus. And Epictetus goes further. He doesn't think that it's ever good to be angry. But he does at least tell you, here's what's going on when you do get angry. And here's what happens every time that you choose to give into it. He actually talks about it as being sort of like opening up old wounds. And why would you want to do that to yourself? And he gives us counsel about how to understand not only our own anger, but other people's anger, and how not to let their anger get to us. One of the things that anger tends to do is to provoke more anger in return. Because if I get angry at you, and you don't feel like I should be getting angry at you, then I'm treating you in a way that you feel is unfair and kind of like putting you down in a certain way, and then you get angry at me. Who are you to get angry at me over this? Who are you to complain? This is very, very common. And Epictetus is really good at saying, look, other people are not going to be completely rational. Hell, you're not even completely rational yourself, and you're trying. So you got to be a bit more understanding of them and try not to say that what they're doing is okay, but try to see things their way, and you will actually find yourself being less angry with them. And if you're going to feel anything, it'll be more like feeling sorry for them, because they're so screwed up that they can't help but get angry over trivial stuff. So, and with Epictetus, there's also, as there was with Aristotle and also with Plato, but with Epictetus a lot more systematically spelled out, how do I change my attitudes, my behavior, my habits? He goes more into detail on that. So I found him very useful. I reject Epictetus's rejection of anger wholesale. I'm more Aristotelian that way. But I think that he has a lot of great advice to contribute. The next person who I would say that I draw on and I'm getting more and more interested in would be St. Augustine. And Augustine, if you had to pick where does he fall in with anger, he's more like Plato, closer to somebody like Epictetus, further away from Aristotle. He does think that there can be legitimate times for us to be angry, but it's very rare, and we got to be really, really careful, because what does anger have a tendency to turn into? Into hatred. And hatred is something that bores into our soul, and it's much harder to get out. Aristotle actually distinguished between anger and hatred by saying that anger is something that is sort of curable, and hatred, really, to a large extent, isn't. Hatred desires for the hated person not even to exist, just to be not be in this universe. Anger wants to hurt the other person because it feels, wronged, but it doesn't go anywhere near where hatred does. And Aristotle didn't look at the relationship between these. Augustine sees that anger can really easily, if it's not dealt with properly, congeal into hatred. And now it becomes much more dangerous. Anger can also turn into these very vicious dispositions that we call wrath. And Augustine himself doesn't talk about, the 8 capital vices or the 7 deadly sins the way a lot of other Christian thinkers will do. But he's very conscious of how detrimental anger can be. At the same time, he doesn't say you should never, ever, ever get angry the way that some Christian thinkers would do. And it's interesting because there's certain, once Christianity enters onto the scene, there's certain biblical verses, particularly from the Sermon on the Mount, where it's a question: how do you interpret this? If it's wrong to get angry at your brother, does that mean it's always wrong to get angry at your brother? This thing about calling your brother racha or fool, how bad is that? And Augustine takes the position that, well, it's not as bad as some things, but it's pretty bad. So you really want to pull that thorn out of yourself of anger. Another person who's really instrumental for me is another Christian thinker, a monk called John Cassian. And what his works consist in is largely taking the wisdom that was communicated to him from the Egyptian desert fathers. Because he was a monk, and he went around with this friend of his who was also a monk. And first he went to Palestine, and then he went into the Egyptian desert. And he'd spend time with these monks who were living in the Egyptian desert, who were struggling with anger problems. Honest to God. I mean, some of the stuff that he says is so brilliant. Like, well, you can go out to the desert, but unless you actually deal with your anger problems, you're going to find yourself like getting angry with the stones. And unless you change your character, and to do that is going to require some sort of some help from above, because you're pretty screwed up. You have to contribute your own part to it as well. For Cassian, unless you do that, your anger isn't going to go away. And he's one of the people who starts writing. He's not the first guy, but he takes up this notion of the 8 capital vices that these desert fathers were thinking about. One of these is wrath, orge, which is the Greek word for anger. And he goes into a lot of detail. And he's drawing on the experience that these guys had of different ways we get angry and how we justify it to ourselves, and how we do things that are good things, but we do it because we're going to stick it to that guy over there. Like fasting, for example. If you fast out of anger, it's not a good fast. It's actually harmful to you, in his view. And he talks about ways in which people are, without using this term, passive-aggressive with each other in terms of their anger, where forgiveness might not be real forgiveness, And so I find his analyses particularly good, in part because, I'm an angry person, and I see some of these things applying to me. And these desert fathers really understood human nature well. And so Cassian is drawing on their wisdom. And then I suppose the next person I would talk about would be Thomas Aquinas. And Thomas has discussions of anger. He doesn't have a treatise on anger. He deals with it largely in terms of the passions, and also in terms of the vices and virtues, and also in terms of the 7 deadly sins, which are what the 8 capital vices become as they get transformed in Western Christianity largely through the intermediary of Gregory the Great's Moralia on Job. For Thomas, anger, he's Aristotelian in this sense. Anger has a legitimate role. In fact, its job is to help us attain what he calls the difficult good. There's goods that are easy to attain, and then there's goods that are kind of like, threatened. And so, sticking up for my kids again, getting angry and sticking up for them, that would be, if I'm doing it rightly, attaining the difficult good. So he's very attentive to the legitimate, scope that anger would have. And he's drawing on Aristotle, but he's also drawing on Christian tradition to make sense of this. And he gives us a lot of quite powerful tools. He talks about the daughters of anger. What are the different roles, I mean not roles, but what are the different forms that anger takes? And when we do that sort of thing, it helps us to identify, I've got a problem with this one over here. And why do I have a problem with that? What sort of assumptions am I making that lead me to, think that person's my enemy and I have to hurt them, or I have to feel this feeling of anger towards them. So at this point in my development and at this point in my studies, I would say those are the six thinkers that I have found most illuminating in their discussions of anger, the ones that I found the most helpful. I've done work on a lot of other people on anger, particularly modern thinkers like Rene Descartes and Thomas Hobbes and Jeremy Bentham. And they tend to treat anger, I feel, in rather reductive ways that don't do justice to what's actually going on when we feel angry. I think the ancients and the medievals, for the most part, understood anger better than many of the modern theorists do. The exception to that would be, I would say, somebody like Dietrich von Hildenbrand. I very much like his discussion of anger in his works, but he was attentive to the role of emotions and affectivity. And it's interesting because he sees anger as something that is somewhat different from the other emotions and doesn't tie into the highest parts of ourselves. So it's not as revelatory of things as love could be, but it's not bad in the same way that pride and concupiscence and hatred are. So I find that attractive as well. I have a lot more to do in my studies on anger, particularly as I want to write on this. But I'll level with you. A lot of what I need to do is be more consistent in applying this stuff to my own life, and particularly with those with whom I'm close. That's the biggest set of challenges for me. I don't know what the challenges for any of those watching this video may be, but that's my greatest weak area that I need to work on. And these thinkers really do help me to make sense out of things.